Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I found my neighbor on the dark web. Since that day, I see woman on his window waving at me. Part 1. Curiosity got the best of me. Okay, so this is going to sound weird. And trust me, I didn't expect any of this. Honestly, I don't even know why I'm typing this out. Maybe it's to warn people, or maybe it's because I feel like I need to get this off my chest. Either way, here we go. So, let's start with the basics. I live in a pretty normal suburban neighborhood. You know the kind. Houses that look almost identical. Quiet streets. Neighbors that you barely talk to, but wave at when you're taking out the trash. One of those places where nothing really happens, and that's exactly what I liked about it. Peace and quiet, or at least, that's how it was until I got too curious for my own good. It all started a couple of months ago. There's this guy who lives across the street from me. Let's call him Bill for the sake of the story. Bill was, well, weird. Not in a creepy, I'm going to kidnap you way, but just a guy who kept to himself. He worked nights or something because he'd always be out at odd hours, and his house lights were almost never on during the day. We've lived across from each other for a few years, and I can count on one hand how many times I've actually spoken to him. That was fine by me. I'm not exactly the most social person either. Anyway, one night I was bored out of my mind. You know when you're scrolling through YouTube, Reddit, whatever, and nothing is hitting the spot? That was me. I remembered reading about the deep web a while back and how it was full of sketchy stuff, but also some underground communities and weird websites. Not gonna lie. The idea of exploring something like that sounded kind of thrilling, like a place where you could find the kind of things you wouldn't see on your regular Google searches. I should have left it at that, a passing thought, but nope. Curiosity got the best of me, and before I knew it, I was downloading Tor and messing around with it. Now, I'm not some tech genius. I don't know how to hack or anything like that. I was just clicking around, browsing these random message boards and marketplaces. At first, it was mostly people selling drugs, stolen credit card info, counterfeit money, stuff I didn't have any business with. But then I stumbled across this one page. It was simple. No flashy graphics, just plain black text on a white background. The title of the post read, "Find People You Know." I hesitated. The post description was vague, just something like, enter a name and you might be surprised. I was skeptical, of course. It sounded like a scam, and it probably was. But I thought, what the hell? I wasn't putting any personal info in, and I figured it'd just pull up random names from social media or something. But I wanted to test it out, see if it could pull up anything interesting. That's when Bill popped into my mind. I hadn't seen him around for a few days, and again, the guy was weird, so I figured, why not? I typed in Bill, followed by his last name. The search bar took a few seconds, like it was really thinking hard about it. Then, the screen refreshed. What popped up next made my stomach drop. It wasn't just some random information about Bill. Number it was a live video feed of his house. Not just the outside, but inside. His living room, to be specific. I could see his old leather couch, that ugly painting of a boat on the wall, and Bill himself, sitting on the couch, staring at the TV. I immediately felt my heart racing. How the hell was this possible? Was this a prank? Some kind of deepfake? It had to be, right? But the more I watched, the more it became clear that this was no fake. There was something disturbingly real about it. The way he was moving, scratching his nose, getting up to grab a drink. It was too natural, too fluid. I told myself to close the page, to walk away from my computer, but I couldn't. I was glued to the screen, watching this man I barely knew live his life like I was some kind of invisible voyeur. And that's when I noticed something even stranger. In the corner of the room, barely visible, there was a woman. She was sitting in a chair, just outside the frame, with long dark hair covering her face. At first, I thought she was just a shadow, something my mind was tricking me into seeing. But then, she moved. She lifted her head ever so slightly, and for a second, I swear, she looked directly at the camera, directly at me. That's when I slammed my laptop shut. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt this wave of nausea wash over me. What the hell did I just see? Was Bill in some kind of trouble? Was that woman holding him hostage? Should I call the cops? I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was just a weird, deep web trick. But the next day, when I looked out my window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Bill's house looked exactly the same as in the video. Same couch, same painting, same eerie feeling. But now, standing in his window, was the woman, and she was waving. Part 2. The woman in the window. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, or at least what little I could see of it. That dark, matted hair hanging over her features, the pale hand waving from Bill's window. It's like the image was burned into the back of my eyelids. I told myself I was just overreacting. It had to be some kind of glitch or trick. Maybe it wasn't even Bill's house I saw on that deep web feed. I mean, yeah, it looked the same, but there are hundreds of houses with leather couches and ugly boat paintings, right? But the next morning, when I looked out the window again, I saw her, standing there, in the exact same spot, in the exact same window, waving. This time it was slow, almost robotic, just a back and forth motion, like she was on some kind of loop. And Bill, nowhere to be seen. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring back at her, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Should I call the cops? What would I even tell them? Hi, officer. Yeah, there's a woman in my neighbor's window, and she's been waving at me for the past 12 hours. That would go over great. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I looked away, something bad would happen. My instincts were telling me that whatever was going on inside that house wasn't normal. So I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I grabbed my phone, zoomed in, and took a picture. My hands were shaking, and I was breathing way too fast. The more I stared at the screen, the more uneasy I felt. I zoomed in as much as I could, trying to get a better look at her face. But here's the thing, no matter how close I got, her features stayed blurred. It wasn't like she was out of focus or the picture was grainy. It was more like her face refused to be seen, like it was smudged, almost distorted. It sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to go over there and knock on Bill's door, ask him who the hell this woman was, and why she was staring at me like that. But something kept me rooted in place. Fear. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. Instead, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I logged back into the dark web. Yeah, I know. It's like one of those horror movies where the idiot character decides to go into the creepy basement after hearing weird noises. But I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them by staring at her from across the street. I went back to the same site, the one where I found the live feed of Bill's house. My heart was pounding as I typed in his name again. The search bar loaded for a second, then nothing. No video feed, no trace of anything that I had seen the night before. For a second, I thought maybe the site had just been taken down, or maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I noticed something else. There was a new post. Same plain white background, same black text. It wasn't long, just a single sentence that sent a chill straight down my spine. Look closer. I stared at it, my palms sweating. What did that mean? Look closer at what? The woman? Bill's house? My stomach twisted into knots, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. Was this some kind of sick game? Against my better judgment, I stood up and walked to the window again. Sure enough, she was still there, still waving. But this time, something was different. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, and for the first time, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. The chair. There was a chair behind her in the room, barely visible through the reflection of the glass. I hadn't noticed it before. It looked old, like something you'd find in a dusty attic. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what was on the chair. There was something tied to it. A figure, slumped, limp, like a rag doll. I squinted, trying to make out more details. Was it a person? My heart skipped a beat as the realization hit me like a freight train. It was Bill. He was tied to the chair, his head hanging forward, like he was unconscious or worse. And the woman? She kept waving, her movements slow and steady, as if nothing was wrong. Like Bill being tied to that chair was just a regular Tuesday afternoon for her. Panic set in. What the hell was going on? Was this some kind of sick setup? Was Bill hurt? Should I call the cops now? I fumbled for my phone, my fingers slipping on the screen as I tried to dial 911. But before I could hit the call button, I glanced back at the window one last time and froze. The woman had stopped waving. She was just standing there, perfectly still, her eyes locked on mine. And then, slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hand and pointed, not at me, at my front door. Part 3. The knock at the door. I'm not proud to admit this, but after she pointed at my door, I froze, like a complete idiot. My brain short-circuited. Every logical thought in my head just stopped, and all I could do was stand there, like a deer caught in headlights. Her finger, pale and bony, stayed raised, pointing at my front door with a slow, unnatural precision. Her eyes, those dark, empty pits locked onto mine. It was like she knew. She knew I was watching her, and she wasn't done with me. My phone buzzed in my hand, snapping me out of whatever trance I'd fallen into. I nearly dropped it. It was still on the 911 screen, my thumb hovering over the call button, but I didn't press it. Why didn't I press it? I don't have a good answer. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was something more primal, something in the back of my mind telling me that the cops weren't going to be able to help me with this, whatever this was. And then, just as I was about to regain control of my body, I heard it. A knock. A single, slow knock on my front door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I looked back at the window, hoping, praying that the woman was still there, that she hadn't moved. But she wasn't waving anymore. She was gone. The window was empty. My whole body went cold. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the now vacant window, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The knock echoed in my head. I knew something was at my door. And it wasn't Bill. It wasn't anyone I wanted to see. I don't know what came over me, but I moved toward the door. It was like my body was acting on autopilot. My heart was screaming, "No, don't do it!" But my legs kept moving, taking me closer and closer to that damn door. My hand was trembling as I reached for the doorknob, but before I could touch it, the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. It wasn't the polite kind of knock someone gives when they're delivering a package or asking for directions. It was slow, deliberate, like whoever or whatever was on the other side wanted me to know they weren't going anywhere. My fingers froze just inches from the knob. For a moment, everything was still. The world outside was quiet, eerily quiet. No wind, no cars, no sound at all. Just the heavy silence pressing down on me. I could feel the presence on the other side of the door, waiting. And then, the handle turned. Slowly. I staggered back, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what was happening. I hadn't touched the knob, but it was moving, turning on its own. I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table in my living room and landing hard on the floor. My phone slipped from my hand, skidding across the hardwood. I scrambled to get up, but before I could, the door creaked open. A sliver of darkness from the outside world seeped in through the crack, and then there was a figure. It wasn't her, at least not at first. It was Bill. Or what used to be Bill. He was standing in the doorway, hunched over, his clothes hanging off him like they were 3 sizes too big. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were sunken deep into his skull. He wasn't looking at me, though. He was staring at the floor, swaying slightly, like he was about to collapse. I wanted to call out to him, ask him if he was okay, but my throat felt like it had been stuffed with cotton. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only watch as Bill slowly, methodically, stepped into my house. His feet dragged across the floor, each step heavy and deliberate, like he hadn't walked in days. The door behind him creaked as it swung open wider, letting in more of that thick, oppressive darkness. And then I saw her, the woman. She was standing just behind him, half hidden in the shadows of the doorway. Her face was still obscured by that curtain of hair, but I could feel her eyes on me, watching, waiting. Her hand reached out, bony fingers curling around Bill's arm, guiding him further into my house, like he was some kind of puppet. And that's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. Bill wasn't walking on his own. She was pulling him. I could see the thin, almost invisible strings attached to his arms, his legs, the corners of his mouth. The way he moved, it was unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by some unseen force. He wasn't alive anymore. Not really. I scrambled backward, pushing myself against the wall, my mind screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But I was trapped. They were blocking the only exit. The woman stepped forward, her head tilting to the side as she dragged Bill with her, those invisible strings pulling tighter and tighter. Bill's head lolled to the side, his mouth hanging open in a twisted, grotesque grin. His eyes, dead and glassy, finally met mine. And then he spoke, but it wasn't his voice. It was hers, that raspy, whispery voice that sounded like it came from deep within the shadows. "You shouldn't have looked." The words echoed in my mind, bouncing around my skull like 1,000 tiny knives. My body went numb. I could feel the blood draining from my face. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run, to hide, to do something. But all I could do was stare as the woman slowly raised her hand again. This time, she wasn't waving. She was pointing at me. The strings pulled tighter, and Bill's body jerked forward, his dead eyes locked onto mine. He stumbled toward me, his arms reaching out, like he was about to grab me, drag me into whatever hell they'd come from. And then, just as his cold, dead hand brushed against my skin, everything went black. Part 4. The darkness that follows. When I woke up, the first thing I felt was the cold. It wasn't the kind of cold you get from an open window or a broken heater. This was deeper, like it was seeping into my bones, chilling me from the inside out. For a second, I couldn't remember where I was or why I was lying on the floor of my living room. But then it all came rushing back. The knock on the door, Bill's dead eyes, the woman pointing at me. My body snapped into survival mode, and I scrambled to my feet, nearly slipping in the process. The room was dark, unnaturally dark. The only light was a faint, sickly glow coming from the hallway outside, barely enough to see by. The front door was wide open, letting in a cold draft. But Bill and the woman, they were gone. I should have been relieved. I should have felt some small bit of safety, knowing they weren't looming over me anymore. But that wasn't the case. If anything, the silence and the empty doorway felt worse. I grabbed my phone off the floor. The screen cracked, but still functional. It was dead. Figures. I plugged it into the charger, hands still shaking, and paced around the room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Every time I tried to think rationally, the image of Bill's lifeless body being dragged across my floor flashed in my mind, and my stomach twisted into knots. After what felt like hours of pacing and listening for any sound, any sign that they might come back, I noticed something strange. The window, the same window where I'd seen the woman, it was different now. Before, it had just been a normal window, nothing special about it. But now, there was something off. The glass looked distorted, like it had been stretched or warped, the edges curling inward ever so slightly. I cautiously approached it, feeling that same sense of dread creeping up the back of my neck. As I got closer, I realized that it wasn't just the glass that was warped. There were fingerprints on the inside, smudged, smeared, like someone had pressed their hands against the window from within my house. I leaned in closer, and that's when I saw it. There, just barely visible in the warped reflection, was the woman. Her face, or what should have been her face, staring back at me from the other side of the glass. It was like she was standing behind me, just out of reach, watching. My breath caught in my throat, and I whipped around, expecting her to be standing there, inches away from me. But there was nothing. Just the empty, silent room. I turned back to the window, but now she was gone. The smudged fingerprints remained, but the reflection was normal again. It was like she had never been there in the first place. My mind was racing. I couldn't stay here. I didn't know what was going on, but every instinct I had was telling me to get out of the house. Now I grabbed my car keys and bolted for the door, not even bothering to look over my shoulder as I practically sprinted to my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling, as I finally managed to get the door unlocked and slide into the driver's seat. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. But just as I was about to turn the ignition, something caught my eye. In the rearview mirror, I saw it. Her, sitting in the back seat. The woman, hair hanging over her face, hands resting in her lap, as still as a corpse. I froze. My hand was on the key, but I couldn't move. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared into the mirror, too terrified to turn around and face her. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. She just sat there, like she had been waiting for me. I felt the cold seeping through the car now, the temperature dropping so fast I could see my breath fogging up the windshield. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. My mind was screaming at me to do something, anything, but I was paralyzed by fear. I tried to focus on the mirror, tried to see if I could make out her face behind that curtain of hair. But the more I stared, the more distorted it became, like her whole body was flickering in and out of existence. And then she moved, her head tilted to the side, just like before, slowly, deliberately, as if she was studying me. I felt my blood run cold as she lifted her hand, just like she had in the window. That slow, unsettling gesture. But this time, she wasn't pointing at the door. She was pointing down. I looked down at the floor of the car, confused, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A pair of shoes. Bill's shoes. My heart stopped as I realized Bill's lifeless body was sprawled across the floor in the back seat, his cold, dead hand resting just inches from my leg. His face was turned toward me, his eyes open wide, staring up at me with that same grotesque grin. I screamed and yanked the door open, tumbling out of the car and onto the pavement. My knees hit the ground hard, but I didn't care. I scrambled away, my heart racing, trying to put as much distance between myself and that car as possible. I looked back, expecting to see her, expecting to see Bill's body dragging itself out of the car, but nothing. The car was empty. The door hung open, the interior dark and silent. I stumbled back toward the house, my legs barely holding me up. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I couldn't think straight. I just knew one thing. She wasn't done with me. I could feel her, somewhere, watching, waiting, and that's when I heard it again. That knock. But this time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the window. Part 5. The final revelation. The knock at the window rattled me down to my core. My legs nearly gave out, but somehow I managed to stay on my feet. My body was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but I couldn't. Something, some invisible force, kept pulling me back. The knock came again, a slow, deliberate tap, 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 like someone was gently reminding me that they were there, waiting. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and turned toward the window. At first, I didn't see anything, just the familiar outline of the warped glass, distorted and stretched like it had been pulled out of some nightmare. But as I stepped closer, a shape slowly emerged from the shadows, a figure standing just on the other side, pressing its face to the glass. It was her, the woman. Her hand was raised again, fingers splayed against the glass, her face still hidden beneath that curtain of hair. But this time, there was something different. The handprint she left behind wasn't just a smudge. It was a perfect, bloody imprint. I could see the dark red dripping down the glass, pooling at the bottom. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the spot as I watched her head tilt again, just like it had before. Those unseen eyes boring into me through the glass. And then she spoke. Her voice wasn't the whispery rasp I had heard through Bill. This time, it was deeper, darker, more alive. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the very air around me. "You've seen too much." My stomach dropped. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing fit. Why was this happening to me? What had I done to deserve this? I staggered backward, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I realized something else. There was no escape. The front door was wide open, just like before, but outside, it wasn't my neighborhood. It wasn't the quiet street with the identical houses and well-kept lawns. It was nothing. Just an endless, suffocating black void stretching out as far as I could see. I was trapped. I stumbled back, my back hitting the wall. I glanced at my phone, hoping, praying that it had charged enough for me to call someone, anyone. But as I lifted it, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The screen was filled with a live video feed of me. It was the same feed I'd seen on the dark web, the one that had shown Bill's house, Bill's living room. But now, it was my house, my living room. Me, standing there, terrified, with the woman just inches from the window, watching. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the horrifying truth. I was part of it now. Whatever this was, this twisted, dark web nightmare, I had become one of the shows, and there was no way out. I heard a low creak and looked up to see the woman moving. Slowly, she lifted her hand away from the window, leaving behind streaks of blood. She stepped back, disappearing into the shadows once again, but the presence remained. I could feel her, waiting, watching. The video feed on my phone shifted, showing me something new. A face. My face. But it wasn't me. At least not anymore. The version of me on the screen was smiling, a wide, twisted grin stretching across my face, my eyes dark and empty, just like Bill's had been. I felt the panic rising in my chest. I wasn't safe. Not in my house. Not outside. Not anywhere. She was inside me now, part of me, and she wasn't going to stop. I needed to get out of the house. Even if there was nowhere to go, I couldn't just stand there, waiting for her to take me like she had taken Bill. I bolted for the front door, running straight into the black void beyond. It was like plunging into ice water, freezing, thick, suffocating. The world around me vanished, swallowed by the darkness, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe I'd just disappear into nothingness, and this nightmare would finally end. But it didn't. I hit something solid, and the world snapped back into focus. I was standing in front of Bill's house. His front door was open, and from where I stood, I could see straight into the living room. The same leather couch, the same ugly boat painting, and in the middle of the room, the same chair. Bill was sitting in it. No strings this time, no woman pulling him. He was just sitting there, perfectly still, his head slumped forward, eyes staring blankly at the floor. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I stepped inside. My body moved on its own, like I wasn't in control anymore. The air inside Bill's house was thick with the stench of decay, and every step I took felt heavier than the last. When I finally reached him, I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring down at the lifeless body that had once been my neighbor. And then, he moved. His head jerked up, his eyes locking onto mine, that grotesque grin spreading across his face. Once again, his lips parted, and in that same deep, hollow voice, he whispered, "You're next." Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, and I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around. It was her. But this time, her face was clear. I could see every detail. The pale, hollow cheeks, the wide, empty eyes, the lips curled into a smile that didn't belong on any human face. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. And then, just like before, everything went black. I woke up this morning in my bed. At first, I thought it had all been a nightmare, a vivid, terrible dream that my mind had cooked up in the dead of night. But then I saw it, the woman, in Bill's window, waving. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was just waiting. And this time, I knew exactly what that meant. I found a priest's diary on the deep web from 1910. The contents of this haunt me to this day. Part 1. The first click. Alright, let me start by saying that I'm not one of those people who regularly browse the dark corners of the internet. I'm a pretty normal guy, working a regular 9 to 5, and I've always heard that the deep web is a place you don't want to mess with. But you know how it is. Curiosity gets the better of you, and one night, after a couple of beers and way too much time on Reddit, I found myself reading about the weirdest stuff people had found on the deep web. I'd heard stories, forums full of conspiracy theories, strange marketplaces where you could buy, well, just about anything you can imagine, and even places that host streams of, let's just say, stuff no one should be watching. But what I was really interested in were those bizarre, hidden corners of the internet that seemed almost like a myth. Old, forgotten archives, strange documents, that kind of thing. I'd always had a fascination with lost history, stuff that never made it into the books. So, against my better judgment, I downloaded Tor. If you don't know, Tor is basically the browser you need to access the deep web. I'm not gonna lie, when I first opened it up, I was nervous, but it's surprisingly unremarkable at first. It looks just like any other browser, except everything feels a little too quiet. There's no Google, no Facebook, no social media buzzing at you. Just pages of links with weird, cryptic titles. I clicked through a few random forums, and it was mostly just boring stuff. Nothing like the horror stories I'd read about. But then I found something. There was this old-looking link buried deep in a random thread. The title was in Latin, Diarium Sacerdotis, which, thanks to a couple of years of high school Latin, I knew translated to priest's diary. It looked like an archive from some old Catholic church dated back to 1910. Honestly, I didn't expect much, but I thought, why not? What's the harm in reading a priest's old journal, right? I clicked. The page loaded slowly, like it had been forgotten for decades. The background was this dull beige color, and the text looked like it had been typed up on a typewriter. At the top was a single sentence. What you seek shall be found in darkness. Typical deep web nonsense. Below that, a file link. Against every instinct I had, I downloaded it. The file was small, no more than a few megabytes, and when I opened it, it was just a scanned document. It looked like a journal, yellowed with age, the handwriting old and spidery. It was written entirely in English, though it was clear that whoever had written it wasn't a native speaker. The diary belonged to a priest named Father Antonio Maria, stationed in some tiny nameless town somewhere in Europe, if I had to guess. I started reading, and the first few entries were pretty standard. He talked about his daily life, the people in his parish, and the weather, mundane stuff. But then, around the 5th or 6th entry, things started to shift. He wrote about a strange occurrence at the church. Last night, I heard them again, the footsteps, like a soft whisper across the floor of the chapel. Yet, No one was there. I prayed for deliverance, but the air hung heavy with something darker. I fear what lies in wait. That caught my attention. Footsteps in an empty chapel. It seemed like the beginning of some ghost story, but it was written with a level of sincerity that creeped me out. I could almost imagine this poor guy, alone in his little parish, hearing footsteps echo through an empty church, with no one around to explain them. I laughed it off, telling myself it was just an old man's imagination, but the entries kept getting weirder. He started mentioning strange visitors, people coming to the church in the dead of night, people he had never seen before, and who would disappear just as quickly as they arrived. They never spoke to him, just stood there, watching as he prayed. I know not if these men are real, or if they are demons sent to test me. They come only at night, their faces hidden in the shadows. I hear their murmurs, low and guttural, like animals speaking words not meant for human ears. It was the kind of description that made my skin crawl, but I kept reading. I was hooked by now, completely absorbed in this old priest's unraveling sense of reality. The more I read, the more it felt like Father Antonio was losing his mind. He wrote about how the nights had grown longer, how the darkness in the chapel felt thicker, almost alive. And then he wrote about the basement. There's a room below the church, one that I was forbidden to enter by the bishop when I first arrived. He said it was a place of great sin, a place where the light of God had long since abandoned. Tonight, I ventured there. I must confess, I regret this deeply. The air was cold, unnaturally cold, and it felt as though the very walls were whispering to me, calling my name in voices I did not recognize. Now, I'm not a religious guy, but something about that entry messed with me. It wasn't just the way he described it, but the fact that he seemed genuinely terrified. I mean, this guy was a priest, right? He's supposed to be the one who stands up to evil, who's not afraid of dark basements or strange noises, but he was losing it, and fast. The more I read, the more disturbing the entries became. Father Antonio started describing rituals. He didn't explain them in detail, but there were hints, references to ancient practices that had been passed down in secret, things that no man of God should witness. He talked about finding strange symbols carved into the walls of the basement, symbols he didn't recognize, but that filled him with dread. And that's when I noticed something strange. The file, this journal, was huge. I'd only read maybe 20 or 30 entries, and there were hundreds more. But something about the dates didn't add up. The first entries were from 1910, but as I scrolled further down, I saw dates going into the 1920s, the 1930s, even the 1950s. There was no way this guy had been alive that long. And yet, the handwriting never changed. Part 2. The Basement of Silence. All right, so I left off where the dates in the diary didn't add up. I remember staring at my screen, just sitting there in my dark apartment, the only light coming from my monitor. The longer I looked at it, the less sense it made. Father Antonio's writing was consistent, same shaky, spidery handwriting all throughout, but the dates were jumping decades. 1910, 1923, 1936, even 1952. I scrolled back and forth, thinking maybe there had been a mistake, or maybe someone had tampered with the file, but I couldn't explain the handwriting. And it wasn't like there were gaps in the diary. It wasn't like he'd stopped writing for years and then picked it up again. No, it was continuous. almost daily entries, as if Father Antonio had never stopped. At this point, I was already starting to freak out a bit, but a part of me was hooked. I had to know what this guy had written, especially if it had something to do with the basement he'd mentioned. There was something about that, something unsettling that I couldn't shake. A room that the bishop had warned him never to enter. That's the kind of thing you hear in horror movies or campfire stories, not something that actually happens in real life. I clicked back to the entries. The dates didn't matter anymore. I just wanted to know what he had seen down there. I returned to the basement tonight. I cannot help myself. It calls to me like a siren, and I am a weak man. The door was heavy, far heavier than it should have been. As I descended the stairs, that cold, unnatural cold, returned, creeping up my spine like a sickness. He talked about the smell, damp and earthy at first, but as he got deeper, it turned to something far worse. He didn't say what exactly, but I could fill in the blanks. You know that smell of rot, when meat has been left out too long, or when you walk past a dead animal on the side of the road. That's what I imagined. Then he started talking about the sounds. At first, he described them as faint murmurs, almost like wind passing through cracks in the walls. But the deeper he went, the clearer they became. Whispering, voices, but not in any language he understood. He said they sounded like prayers, twisted, broken prayers. The walls, they speak. I hear them. They say things I cannot repeat, things that no man of God should hear. And the symbols, they glow faintly now, as if they are alive. I tried to cover them, but they burned beneath my touch. This place is cursed. I know it now. By this point, I was sitting on the edge of my seat. I mean, this guy sounded like he was in full-on panic mode, and I could feel it. The way he described the darkness, the cold, those voices, it was like I could hear it, too. I know it's stupid, but I actually found myself glancing around my apartment, half expecting to see something in the shadows. But I wasn't ready to stop. The next few entries were scattered, almost frantic. Father Antonio was slipping. He talked about nightmares, visions of fire, of figures standing in the darkness, watching him. He wrote about the visitors again, those strange people who appeared in the church late at night, standing in the pews without moving, their faces hidden. And then, one night, they followed him down to the basement. They came tonight. I do not know how, but they were there when I opened the door. 5 of them, standing in a perfect line, their faces obscured by shadow. I asked what they wanted, but they did not answer. They only watched, their heads cocked to the side, as if waiting for something. I tried to leave, but my feet would not move. And then, they smiled. The way he described it made my blood run cold. He said they smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was wrong, like their faces weren't made for it. He couldn't see their eyes, but he knew they were staring right at him, following his every move. He didn't go back to the basement after that, at least not for a few days. But then, things took a turn. I received a letter today from the bishop. He warns me that the town has been marked, though he does not say by what. He tells me to leave, to abandon my post, but I cannot. The people need me, even though they do not see what I see. They are blind to it. But I fear they may be lost already. A few more entries passed, and the tone shifted. Father Antonio wasn't just afraid anymore. He was angry. He wrote about how the town had changed, how the people were different now. They came to the church, but not to pray. They came at odd hours, just standing in the aisles, staring at him. They didn't speak. didn't even move. And then, one night, something changed. The air has grown thick with smoke. I can smell it now, even in the chapel. The visitors have multiplied, and they no longer remain in the shadows. They approach me now, their faces still twisted, still smiling. I fear for my soul, but I cannot leave. The bishop was wrong. This place, it cannot be abandoned. It must be destroyed. That was the last full entry. There were fragments after that, pages that looked like they had been torn or damaged. The last thing he wrote was almost unreadable, but I could make out a few words: sacrifice, fire, and forgive me. After that, the journal just stopped. I remember sitting there, feeling this strange mix of fascination and dread. It didn't feel like a story. It felt like a confession, like this poor priest had witnessed something that no one else could see, and it had driven him to madness. But the question that kept eating at me was, why was this on the deep web? How had this journal survived for so long, and why hadn't anyone else found it? And then something weird happened. My computer screen flickered. It was quick, just a brief flash of static, but it was enough to jolt me. I sat there staring at the screen, waiting for it to happen again, but it didn't. I figured it was just my laptop acting up. It's old and has a tendency to glitch out sometimes. But in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe it wasn't just a glitch. Maybe something else had been watching. I closed the file, shut my laptop, and sat there in the dark for a while. My heart was racing, and I couldn't stop thinking about that basement, those symbols, the way the visitors had just stood there, silently watching. There was something wrong with that place, something far beyond what Father Antonio could understand. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot, because later that night I got an email. Part 3. The email. That night I couldn't sleep. The diary kept running through my mind, especially that last entry. Sacrifice, fire, forgive me. It was like Father Antonio knew something terrible was coming, something unavoidable, and yet he stayed, like he was resigned to whatever fate waited for him in that cursed basement. But the thing that bothered me most was the glitch on my computer. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a coincidence. I know it sounds paranoid, but after reading those entries, my mind was already in overdrive. You ever get that feeling that something's watching you, even when you know you're alone? That's what it was like. My apartment felt different, too quiet, like the walls were listening. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. I even laughed at how ridiculous I was being. But that email, that's where everything shifted. It came through around 2 a.m., just after I'd finally managed to drift off. I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand, and when I checked it, there it was. One new email. The subject line was blank. No name in the from field. Just a string of random characters that looked like gibberish. I thought it was spam at first, something that slipped through my filter. But when I opened it, the body of the email was just one sentence. You shouldn't have read that. My stomach dropped. I stared at the words, blinking, waiting for it to make sense, but it didn't. The timing, the message, it was too specific. Someone knew I had accessed the journal. I instantly regretted downloading that file. My mind started racing, thinking maybe I had tripped some kind of digital trap, like those websites you hear about that track anyone who visits them. Maybe the whole thing was a setup, and now they were trying to scare me. But then the second email came through. This one had a subject, "Stop now," and below it, a single attachment. I didn't want to open it. I knew I shouldn't, but at that point, it was like I couldn't help myself. I clicked on the file, expecting some kind of virus, but it wasn't. Instead, it was a photo, and what I saw almost made me drop my phone. It was a picture of the basement from Father Antonio's journal. I hadn't seen it before, but the description was burned into my mind. The walls were cold stone, damp and crumbling, with symbols carved deep into the surface. The picture was grainy, like it had been taken on an old camera, but it was clear enough to make out the details, the strange markings, the dark pool of shadow that stretched across the floor like a stain, and in the center of the room, a figure stood. I couldn't make out much of the figure's features. It was shrouded in a heavy robe, its face obscured by the hood, but the way it stood there, motionless, facing the camera, it was like whoever or whatever it was had been waiting for me to see it. I locked my phone and threw it onto the bed, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real. It had to be some elaborate prank, maybe someone from the deep web messing with me because I'd clicked on the wrong link. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why send me that photo? How did they know what I'd been reading? And most importantly, how did they know what the basement looked like? I couldn't stay in bed. I got up, pacing around my room, my mind buzzing with questions I couldn't answer. Every little sound in the apartment, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, like there was something else there with me, hiding just beyond the edges of my vision. And then, I made a mistake. I opened my laptop. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe I thought I could find more answers in the diary, or maybe I just needed to confirm that none of this was real. But when I booted up my computer, the file was gone. I checked my downloads folder, my desktop, everywhere. Nothing. It was as if the journal had never existed. The weirdest part? Every other file was still there. Documents, photos, music. Everything was fine. But that file, Darium Sacerdotis, was just gone. That's when the fear really set in. I had no way of explaining it. No rational reason why the file would just disappear. And the emails, whoever was sending them, they knew what I'd seen. They were warning me to stop, but I didn't even know how to stop something I couldn't understand. The next few hours were a blur. I kept my lights on, sitting on my couch with my laptop in front of me, refreshing my inbox like some new message would show up and explain everything. But nothing came. By the time the sun started to rise, I hadn't slept at all. The tension in my body was unbearable, every muscle tight with that gnawing sense of dread that had been following me since I opened that journal. I was exhausted, but I couldn't let it go. I thought about just leaving the apartment, getting out for a while, but then I remembered something Father Antonio had written about how the town had changed, how the people had grown cold, distant. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I went outside, I'd see the same thing. People with those blank stares, smiling in that wrong, twisted way. So I stayed inside, and that's when I made the decision to search for more information on the journal. Maybe someone else had seen it. Maybe it was a hoax. Or maybe there was some historian or occult expert who could explain what the hell I had stumbled into. I dove into forum after forum, looking for any mention of Father Antonio, of the church, or those symbols. But there was nothing. It was like the diary didn't exist, at least not on the regular web. I even went back to Tor, searching through old threads, scouring every corner I could find. Still, nothing. But then, something clicked. It was the date. The journal had started in 1910, but I remembered that the entries had jumped to later years. 1923, 1936, 1952. The further I got into the entries, the more recent the dates became. And then I realized the last date, the one from the final, almost unreadable entry, was 2023. The same year, I found the journal. My blood ran cold. It couldn't be a coincidence. Somehow, this journal, this diary of a priest who should have been long dead, had followed the years, and now it had caught up to me. Just as I was starting to piece it all together, my phone vibrated again. Another email. This one was different. No gibberish sender, no cryptic message in the subject line. Just 2 words. Look outside. I didn't want to. Everything in my body screamed at me to ignore it, to shut my laptop and turn off my phone, but my hand moved on its own. Slowly, I stood and walked to the window. The blinds were drawn, but there was a sliver of light coming through the edge, casting a thin line of brightness across the floor. I pulled the blinds aside, just enough to look out, and standing in the street, staring up at my window, were 3 figures. They didn't move, they didn't speak, just stood there, their faces obscured by shadows, exactly like Father Antonio had described in his diary. The smile on their faces, it wasn't human. Part 4. The Watchers. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at them through the window. Time felt distorted, like everything around me had slowed down. Those 3 figures were motionless, but the longer I looked, the more I could feel them staring back at me, even though I couldn't see their eyes. They just stood there, perfectly still, and even from inside my apartment, I could feel the weight of their presence. My mouth was dry, my heart thudding in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Something about the way they stood, so unnaturally still, sent a chill down my spine. The shadows hid their faces, but I knew if I stepped outside, I'd see them smiling. The same twisted, wrong smile Father Antonio had described in his journal. The thought made my skin crawl. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to step away from the window. My hands were shaking, and I could barely breathe. I stumbled back toward my couch, grabbing my phone. I don't know what I was planning to do. Call the police? Tell them there were people standing outside my window? What would I even say? That I'd found some cursed diary on the deep web, and now strange, smiling figures were stalking me. They'd think I'd lost my mind. I stared down at my phone. The screen still showed the last email. Look outside. I couldn't get it out of my head. Whoever had sent that, they knew what was happening. Maybe they were part of it. Maybe they were watching me. But how and why? I opened my email again, desperate for any kind of clue. But there was nothing new, just that same chilling message. I swiped back to the previous emails, hoping to find something I'd missed, but then I noticed something strange. The first email, the one that had said, "You shouldn't have read that," was gone. I hadn't deleted it. I was sure of that. And yet, it wasn't in my inbox anymore. I checked the trash folder, searched for it, but it was as if it had never been sent in the first place. The second email was still there, along with the photo of the basement, but that first one had vanished without a trace. I was starting to feel trapped, like the walls were closing in around me. The air in my apartment felt heavy, almost suffocating. I had to get out of there. Maybe it was paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that staying in one place, especially in my apartment, was only making things worse. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, my heart racing. As I stepped into the hallway, I hesitated, glancing back toward the window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I had to know if they were still there. Slowly, I inched toward the window again, careful to stay out of sight. I peeked through the blinds, just enough to see the street below. The figures were gone. For a second, relief washed over me. But then I realized I hadn't heard anything. No footsteps, no car engines, no sound of anyone walking away. They had just vanished as silently as they had appeared. That didn't feel right. I hurried down the stairs and out into the cold night air. My breath came in short, panicked bursts as I looked around, half expecting to see those figures waiting for me in the shadows. But the street was empty, not a single person in sight. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started walking, not really knowing where I was going, just needing to get as far away from my apartment as possible. My mind was racing, running through all the strange things that had happened since I'd opened that file. The diary, the disappearing emails, the figures outside my window. None of it made sense, but it was real. I couldn't deny that anymore. I walked for what felt like hours, just letting the city lights blur around me. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see those 3 figures standing behind me, following me. But they weren't there, at least not that I could see. I ended up in a small diner, the kind that stays open 24 hours and is mostly empty at this time of night. I slid into a booth by the window, ordered a coffee, and tried to clear my head. The waitress barely looked at me as she set the mug down, and I was grateful for that. I wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone. I stared at the steam rising from the coffee, my hands wrapped tightly around the mug, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. But it was impossible. Even here, in this diner, with the sound of clinking dishes and quiet conversation in the background, I felt it. The eyes, they were still on me. I pulled out my phone again, half expecting another email, but there was nothing. The inbox was empty. No more cryptic messages, no more warnings. But I knew this wasn't over. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring at my phone, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But eventually, I made a decision. I needed to know more about that church. I needed to know who Father Antonio was, where he had come from, and what had happened in that basement. It was the only way to make sense of any of this. I started researching, digging deeper into anything I could find about old churches, forgotten towns, priests who had disappeared under strange circumstances. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but eventually I found something. There was an old article from a small European newspaper, dated sometime in the 1920s. It mentioned a fire that had destroyed a church in a remote village. The name of the priest was never mentioned, but the description matched everything Father Antonio had written about in his journal. The fire had started in the basement, and no one had been able to explain how it spread so quickly. The villagers claimed they saw figures in the flames. I shuddered, remembering Father Antonio's final entry. Sacrifice, fire, forgive me. It couldn't be a coincidence. The basement, the fire, the figures, it all lined up. But that didn't explain why I was being dragged into this. Why had the journal ended up on the deep web? And why had those figures come to my window? I was in too deep now. There was no turning back. I had to keep digging. That's when my phone vibrated again. I nearly dropped it, my hands trembling as I swiped the screen. Another email, but this time there was no subject, just one line of text. They're already inside. My blood ran cold. I looked around the diner, but no one was paying attention to me. The waitress was refilling coffee at another table, and the few other customers were lost in their own conversations. But I knew something was wrong. I could feel it. My phone vibrated again. This time, it was a photo. I hesitated before opening it, my heart racing. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me, but I had to know. It was a picture of my apartment, taken from the inside. The living room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the streetlights coming through the window. And in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. One of them. I bolted from the diner, my coffee forgotten, my mind racing. They were in my apartment. They had been waiting for me, and now they were inside. But how? I hadn't heard anything. I hadn't seen them come in. It was impossible. But it was happening. As I ran down the street, back toward my apartment, I realized the truth. The journal wasn't just a story. Father Antonio hadn't just been haunted by his own demons. Whatever was in that basement, whatever he had unleashed, was still out there. And now, it had found me. Part 5. The final chapter. I sprinted down the street, the cold night air burning in my lungs, but none of it registered. All I could think about was the picture. That figure, standing in the corner of my apartment, waiting. The email had said, "They're already inside." My mind kept replaying it, over and over, like some kind of twisted mantra. They were inside. I rounded the corner onto my block, my heart slamming in my chest. My apartment building loomed ahead, dark and quiet. It looked so normal, like nothing had changed, like my life hadn't just been thrown into this nightmare. But I knew better. Somewhere in there, they were waiting for me. I skidded to a stop outside the front door, fumbling for my keys, my fingers trembling. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, to leave, to run as far away as I could. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me back inside, some force stronger than fear, stronger than reason. Maybe it was the same thing that had pulled Father Antonio down into that basement. Whatever it was, I had to know the truth. I shoved the key into the lock, the door creaking as I pushed it open. The hallway was silent, every footstep echoing off the walls as I made my way toward my apartment. The closer I got, the more suffocating the air felt, thick and heavy, like I was wading through water. By the time I reached my door, I could barely breathe. I stood there, staring at the handle, trying to steady myself. I listened, but there was no sound coming from inside. No movement, no voices, nothing. Just silence. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps, filtering through the blinds. Everything looked the same as I'd left it. My couch, my coffee table, the laptop still sitting where I'd abandoned it. But the air felt wrong. It was colder, like the temperature had dropped by several degrees since I'd been gone. I took a step inside, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed out of place. But I could feel them. I knew they were here. I moved slowly, edging toward the living room, my hands shaking so badly I had to clench them into fists. My gaze darted to the corner of the room, the one from the photo, but there was no one there. No figure standing in the shadows, no strange, twisted smile staring back at me. It was just an empty corner, but the feeling didn't go away. I grabbed my phone, flipping back to the email, staring at the photo again. The figure had been there. I hadn't imagined it. I could still see the faint outline of it, barely visible in the darkness. I looked back at the corner, then at the photo, then at the corner again, and that's when I realized something. The photo wasn't just a picture of my apartment. It was a picture of me, taken from the same spot I was standing in now. My blood turned to ice. I dropped the phone, backing up instinctively, my eyes locked on the corner of the room. There had been something in here, something watching me, but where had it gone? And then I heard it, a soft, low whisper, coming from behind me. I froze. The sound was so faint, like a breeze slipping through a crack in the wall, but it was there, the same whisper Father Antonio had written about in his journal, the same twisted prayers, the words garbled and wrong, like they weren't meant for human ears. Slowly, I turned around, and there they were. Standing in the doorway were the three figures, the same ones that had been outside my window, the same ones from the journal, from Father Antonio's nightmare. They were inside my apartment now, silent, their faces still hidden in shadow. But I knew, even without seeing their eyes, that they were watching me. And then, in unison, they smiled. That same horrible, unnatural smile, stretching too wide, as if their skin didn't quite fit. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my body frozen in place by some invisible force. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, filling the room with a suffocating heavy presence. They started moving toward me, slow and deliberate, their feet never making a sound on the floor. I tried to back away, but I couldn't. I was trapped, just like Father Antonio had been. This was it. They had come for me, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. But then, something changed. The whispers stopped, and the figures halted, just a few feet away from me. For a moment, everything was silent, and then, from somewhere deep in the shadows, a voice, low, raspy, and filled with an authority that made my skin crawl. "He will see you now." I didn't understand. See who? What was happening? But the figures didn't wait for me to process it. They stepped aside, their smiles never fading, and motioned toward the far wall. That's when I saw it. The wall. It was shifting, warping in a way that defied logic. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I realized there was a door I had never seen before, one that had no business being in my apartment. It wasn't made of wood or metal. It looked like stone, ancient and rough, like something you'd see in an old castle or a tomb. I didn't want to go through it. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to get as far away as possible. But the figures were still watching, and that force, the one that had been pulling me toward all of this, was stronger than ever. I had no choice. I stepped toward the door. It opened on its own, a low, grating sound filling the room as the stone slab shifted aside. Beyond it was a staircase, descending into darkness. Cold air rushed out from the opening, carrying with it the smell of earth, of decay, and something else, something older, more sinister. It was the basement. Father Antonio's basement. I was sure of it. Without thinking, I stepped inside. The door closed behind me with a heavy thud, sealing me in. The darkness was thick, suffocating, and the cold seeped into my bones. The whispers started again, louder now, like they were all around me, urging me deeper into the abyss. I walked down the stairs, each step echoing in the silence. The further I descended, the stronger the feeling of dread became. like I was being pulled into the heart of something ancient and evil. The whispers were clearer now, no longer just noise. They were voices, chanting, reciting words in a language I didn't understand, but one that filled me with fear. At the bottom of the stairs, I reached another door. This one was smaller, older, carved with symbols that looked vaguely familiar. The same ones from Father Antonio's journal. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. I knew what was waiting for me on the other side, but I opened it anyway. The room beyond was vast, far larger than it should have been, like it existed outside of space and time. The walls were lined with those same symbols, glowing faintly in the dark, and in the center of the room, a figure stood, cloaked in shadow. He was waiting for me, Father Antonio, or what was left of him. He turned slowly, his eyes hollow, his face gaunt and stretched, like the life had been drained out of him long ago. But I recognized him, the man from the journal, the one who had been trapped in this nightmare for more than a century. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words that came out weren't his own. They were the voices of 1,000 others, speaking in unison, ancient and cold. "It is your turn." That's the last thing I remember before everything went black. When I woke up, I was in my apartment again, lying on the floor. The door to the basement, the figures, Father Antonio, they were gone, like they had never been there in the first place. But I knew better. They had been there, and they had marked me. I've tried to move on, to live a normal life, but it's impossible. Every night, I hear the whispers. They're getting louder, and I know soon they'll come for me again, just like they did for Father Antonio. I was sent to Antarctica to investigate a signal picked up on the dark web. What I found is not human. Alright, so before I get into the meat of this, let me just start off by saying this. I'm not some crazy conspiracy theorist, nor am I the type of person who goes looking for trouble. I'm just a regular guy. Well, I was a regular guy with a regular job. You know, a boring 9 to 5, and the occasional weekend where I'd waste time scrolling through Reddit or getting lost on YouTube rabbit holes. But I've always had this thing for tech, computers, the internet, all that. A while back, I got into some pretty sketchy corners of the web, not for anything too illegal, I swear, but mostly out of curiosity. That's how I ended up on the dark web. Now, if you're thinking I was into buying weird stuff or doing creepy things, nah, that wasn't my vibe. I was just one of those dudes who'd click through different forums and wonder how far this rabbit hole really went. But man, I had no clue what I was getting myself into. It all started when I stumbled upon this one post. Someone was looking for a tech-savvy individual with an adventurous spirit to investigate a mysterious signal coming from Antarctica. Yeah, you read that right. Antarctica. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke, like a role-playing thing, but the more I read, the weirder it got. The post talked about how the signal had been detected deep in the frozen wastelands, but it wasn't being broadcast on any known frequencies. Even weirder, they said it had shown up on the dark web, not through normal scientific means. They wanted to pay someone good money to go down there and check it out. Now, here's the thing. I was broke. Like, really broke. So, when I saw the pay, let's just say it was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. It was hard to ignore. My first instinct was to laugh it off and move on, but something about the whole thing kept pulling me back. Antarctica. A mysterious signal? It sounded ridiculous, but also kind of intriguing. The post didn't have too many details about the signal itself, just that it was unlike anything we've encountered before. Curiosity got the best of me, so I shot a message to the user who posted it. I half expected the whole thing to be a scam, or, at the very least, some dude messing with me for kicks. But, to my surprise, they responded. Fast. Their reply was brief, but professional. They told me that if I was serious about the job, they'd arrange for transportation and equipment. They'd pay for everything. Flights, gear, survival training, the whole deal. All I had to do was get on a plane and show up. Looking back now, I realize how crazy that sounds. I mean, who in their right mind would agree to fly to one of the most dangerous places on Earth based on a sketchy dark web post? But at the time, I guess I just figured, why not? The money was real. I double-checked, and they seemed legit. Or at least as legit as someone could seem on the dark web. Plus, I'd been stuck in the same rut for so long that the idea of an adventure, something completely out of the ordinary, was hard to pass up. So, I agreed. I didn't tell anyone, not even my family. I didn't want to sound like a lunatic explaining to people that I was going to Antarctica because of some signal I found in the shady corners of the internet. That just sounds like the beginning of a bad horror movie, right? They sent me a non-disclosure agreement to sign, which felt a little weird, but I figured it was all part of the process. After I signed it, things moved quickly, way quicker than I expected. Within a week, I had a plane ticket, and there was a package on my doorstep with everything I'd need. Thermal gear, a sat phone, even a small laptop with some weird custom software already installed. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but I packed my bags and got on that plane. When I landed in Ushuaia, Argentina, basically the last stop before you head to the frozen abyss, I started to realize how real this was. A guy met me at the airport. No questions, no introductions. He just handed me a badge that said research consultant and led me to a private plane. There were no other passengers, no flight attendants, just me and the pilot. The next thing I knew, I was strapped into a tiny seat in a noisy, freezing cold cargo plane flying over nothing but ice and snow. The landscape below looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. Nothing for miles, just endless white and a cold that seeps into your bones, even from thousands of feet up. It was only after we landed on a rough strip of ice that I started feeling that gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach, that creeping sense that I'd made a mistake. But by then, it was too late to turn back. As I stepped off the plane, a sharp gust of wind hit me in the face, like Antarctica itself was warning me not to come any closer. A group of people in heavy parkas were waiting for me. They looked like the kind of folks who'd been out there for way too long. Faces red from the cold, eyes a little too distant. One of them, a woman, stepped forward and handed me a radio. Her voice was muffled behind her scarf, but she said, "The station is about 30 miles that way." She pointed to a horizon of nothingness. I stared at her, confused. "Wait, aren't you coming with me?" "No," she replied, and for the first time, I realized something strange. None of them were smiling. "You're on your own now." I stood there, watching the group climb back into the plane, its engines roaring to life. They didn't say goodbye or wish me luck. It was like I was just another package being dropped off, something to be discarded. The plane took off, disappearing into the thick cloud cover, leaving me alone with nothing but a radio and the faint howling of the wind. When I say it was cold, I don't think I can even begin to describe it. The air wasn't just frigid. It felt like it was actively trying to freeze you from the inside out. My breath came out in thick clouds, and the frost on my eyebrows and eyelashes started forming almost immediately. The silence around me was unsettling, like the world had gone mute except for the soft crunch of snow under my boots. I looked out at the endless expanse of white and realized that 30 miles in this place might as well have been 1,000. There was nothing, no landmarks, no trails, just me and that desolate horizon. The GPS device they'd given me flickered faintly in the gray light. I'd been told to follow it precisely. No detours, no stopping. I started walking. Every step felt like a struggle. The snow was deeper than it looked, and my feet sank in with each step. The wind was relentless, constantly changing direction, making it impossible to tell which way was forward without checking the GPS every few minutes. After what felt like hours of trudging through the snow, my mind started playing tricks on me. I could swear I saw shapes moving out of the corner of my eye, dark figures against the blinding white. But every time I turned my head, there was nothing. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue and the overwhelming isolation. Antarctica does weird things to people's minds, right? There are stories of researchers going stir-crazy from the isolation, the endless snow. I figured it was just that, my brain trying to cope with the emptiness. But it wasn't just the shapes. The longer I walked, the more I felt like I wasn't alone out there. It was hard to explain, but it was like the landscape itself was watching me. The air felt heavier, like something unseen was following close behind, just out of sight. Every now and then, I'd hear faint noises, soft whispers carried by the wind, or the creak of ice shifting beneath the snow. I kept telling myself it was normal. This place was supposed to be eerie. About 6 hours into the trek, the light started to fade, the gray sky dimming into a darker shade of nothingness. That's when I first heard it. A sound that didn't belong, faint but distinct, a low hum, almost like static, vibrating through the air. I stopped, turning my head slowly, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't mechanical though. It felt organic, like something alive was broadcasting it. I pulled out the radio, hesitated for a second, then pressed the button. Hey, is anyone there? I think I'm hearing something out here. There was a long stretch of static, then a voice crackled through, distorted by the wind and interference. Keep moving. Don't stop. Stay on course. The tone of the voice was different from before. It wasn't the calm, almost robotic professionalism I'd gotten used to. This time, there was something urgent behind the words, almost panicked. My heart started racing, but I forced myself to keep walking. The hum grew louder. I was getting close to the station, at least according to the GPS. The structure finally came into view, a small, dark shape against the endless white. It wasn't much to look at, just a low, squat building, half buried in snow. The windows were frosted over, and the metal walls were streaked with ice. The closer I got, the louder the hum became, vibrating in my bones, making my teeth ache. When I reached the door, I noticed something off right away. There were no tracks, nothing, not even from the wind filling them in. It was as if no one had been here in months, despite the fact that the station was supposed to be manned year-round. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the latch, the wind whipping around me like it was trying to warn me. But I'd come this far. I couldn't turn back now. I pulled the latch, and the door creaked open with a groan that made my skin crawl. Inside, the air was still stale, like no one had breathed it in a long time. The lights were dim, flickering every few seconds, casting long shadows down the narrow hallway. I stepped in, and the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the empty space. I jumped, my pulse spiking. The hum was still there, louder now, coming from deeper inside the station. I moved cautiously down the hallway, my boots clomping loudly against the metal floor. As I passed through the main corridor, I noticed the odd layout, doors leading to small rooms, most of them locked. A few were ajar, but inside was nothing but basic furniture, a couple of dusty chairs, and old computers that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I reached the control room at the end of the hallway. The hum was almost deafening now, making the walls tremble slightly. Inside, a huge, ancient-looking console dominated the room. It was covered in blinking lights, most of which made no sense to me. But what really caught my eye was the massive screen on the far wall. It was displaying a looping video feed of the outside, static snow, the horizon, nothing else. But then, the screen flickered. Just for a second, I leaned closer, squinting at it. There, in the far corner of the frame, I could see something moving, a shadow, long and misshapen, crossing the snow toward the station. I froze. The shadow wasn't human. I reached for the radio again, my hand trembling as I pressed the button. "Hey, I think I see something outside. Is anyone else out here?" More static, then a reply. This time, the voice sounded different, no longer urgent, just cold, emotionless. "Do not engage. Do not leave the station. It's already too late." I stood there, staring at the radio in my hand, trying to process what I'd just heard. It's already too late. What did they mean by that? Too late for what? My mind was racing, my body frozen in place. That shadow, whatever it was, kept creeping closer on the screen. My instincts were screaming at me to run, to bolt out the door and get as far away from this place as possible. But there was nowhere to go, just an endless expanse of ice and snow. The hum in the air was so loud now that I could feel it vibrating in my skull. It wasn't just a sound. It was like it was alive, seeping into me, digging into my thoughts. I glanced back at the screen, and the shadow had stopped, just at the edge of the camera's view, standing there motionless. It was hard to make out any details through the grainy feed, but whatever it wasn't human. It was too tall, too wrong. Suddenly, the lights in the station flickered, then cut out completely. The only illumination left came from the faint glow of the monitor and the occasional spark from the control panel. My breath caught in my throat, and I fumbled for the flashlight in my pack. The second I clicked it on, I noticed something else. The hum, it had stopped. Dead silence filled the room, as if the air itself had been sucked out. For a second, I thought maybe the station had lost power, but the screen was still on, and the equipment was still humming faintly. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, just outside the control room door. I froze. My mind went blank, every rational thought erased by pure fear. I held the flashlight, in a death grip, pointing it at the door, but part of me didn't want to see what was on the other side. The footsteps stopped, and for a few seconds, there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then came a low scratching sound, like nails or claws dragging across metal. My brain went into overdrive. Nope, 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 I thought. Whatever this was, I didn't want any part of it. I backed up slowly, keeping the flashlight trained on the door, praying it wouldn't open, but the scratching stopped, and instead, I heard a different sound. Something faint, almost like a whisper, except it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the room. I whipped the flashlight around, sweeping the beam across the walls, console, the ceiling, but there was nothing. The room was empty, or at least it looked empty. The whispering grew louder, words I couldn't quite make out. It wasn't English, or if it was garbled, distorted, like someone was speaking through a mirror stand. But it was coming from everywhere it was, surrounding me. I was panicking. Steady. It stopped, and the whispering was filling the room, seeping into my mind the same way that I had. It wasn't just sound. It was like it was inside my head, worming its way into my thoughts, making it hard to think straight. I had to get out of there. I didn't care about the mission, the sickness, the money. None of it mattered anymore. I needed to know. I turned back to the door, fully expecting to see it open, but it was still closed. I reached for the handle, but before I could pull it, the radio crackled to life again. Do not leave the room. The voice was different this time, deeper, more guttural. It didn't sound like the same person who had been giving me instructions before. In fact, it didn't sound like a person at all. There was a coldness to it, an unnatural echo that made my skin crawl. I didn't respond. I just stood there, gripping the door handle, my mind racing. I wanted to scream at them, to ask what the hell was going on, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. Whoever or whatever was on the other end wasn't on my side. I yanked the door open and bolted into the hallway. The station was even darker now, the few emergency lights casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The whispering followed me, growing louder, more insistent, like it was trying to guide me somewhere. I didn't listen. I ran down the corridor, slipping and stumbling over the slick metal floor. The station seemed larger now, the hallway stretching out into impossible lengths, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. I knew it wasn't real. My mind was playing tricks on me, but it didn't matter. I just kept running. I don't know how long I ran before I finally reached another door. I threw it open, half expecting to find another endless corridor, but instead, I found myself in what looked like a storage room. It was small, cluttered with boxes and old equipment, but at least it felt somewhat normal. I slammed the door shut behind me and collapsed against it, breathing hard, trying to steady myself. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the scent of stale air and old metal, but it quickly grew stronger. Rotting meat mixed with something chemical, like sulfur or burnt plastic. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. The room was too small for a smell like that to go unnoticed. Something had died in here, recently. I shone my flashlight around the room, and that's when I saw it. Something slumped in the far corner, half buried under a pile of boxes. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, and the smell hit me full force. It wasn't just a dead animal. It was a body, or at least it used to be. I knelt down, carefully pulling aside the boxes, revealing more of the body. It was human, or had been human, but it was wrong. The skin was stretched too tight over the bones, and parts of it looked almost melted, like it had been exposed to extreme heat, or some kind of corrosive chemical. The eyes were open, but glazed over, and the mouth was twisted into an unnatural grimace, as if the person had died in sheer terror. I stumbled back, my stomach lurching. This wasn't part of the plan. None of this was supposed to happen. I was just supposed to investigate a signal, maybe take some readings, and go home. But now, there was a dead body. Something was out there in the snow, and I had no idea what was going on. I didn't have time to think. The whispering had followed me into the room, louder now, almost deafening. And it was no longer just whispers. It was voices, hundreds of them, speaking in a language I didn't understand, filling my head with static. Then, above the noise, I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time, they weren't outside. They were right behind me. I froze. My heart thudded so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. Those footsteps, they were deliberate, slow, as if whatever was making them wasn't in a hurry, like it knew I had nowhere to run. The room was small, with barely enough space to move between the clutter of boxes and old equipment, but there was no way out. No windows, no secondary doors. The footsteps got closer, and I could feel the vibrations through the metal floor. I didn't dare turn around. Instead, I focused on the body slumped in the corner, the unnatural angle of its limbs, the grotesque expression frozen on its face. I tried to convince myself that whatever was behind me wasn't real, that it was just my mind breaking under the pressure of isolation, fear, and this God-forsaken place. But the heavy thud of those footsteps told me otherwise. They stopped, right behind me. The whispering, the static, the voices, they all swirled around me, pushing into my skull like needles. I could feel my grip on reality slipping, my thoughts becoming cloudy. Slowly, I turned my head, just enough to see out of the corner of my eye. There was something standing there. At first, it was hard to make out in the dim light. It was tall, taller than any person should be. Its silhouette was misshapen, unnatural, like it didn't quite fit into the space it was occupying. My flashlight flickered in my hand, the beam of light shaking as I turned it toward the figure. What I saw didn't make any sense. It looked like a human, or at least it wanted to look like a human. Its face was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tightly over its skull. The skin was smooth, like wax, but there were no eyes, just empty, hollow sockets, oozing something dark. Its mouth was too wide, split from ear to ear, with rows of thin, needle-like teeth, barely visible behind the cracked lips. And its body, Jesus, its body was all wrong. The arms were too long, dragging against the ground, with fingers that ended in sharp, claw-like points. The legs were bent backward, like an animal's, but twisted at grotesque angles. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My body refused to move, as if paralyzed by sheer terror. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, towering over me, its head cocked slightly to one side, like it was curious. It didn't make any noise. No breathing, no growls, nothing, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me with its sheer wrongness. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The only sound in the room was the whispering, which now felt like it was coming from inside the creature. Then it spoke, not with its mouth, but with its presence, as if the air itself was vibrating with its voice. It didn't use words, not ones I could understand anyway, but I felt it, deep in my bones. The closest I could describe it was like a command, an order to stay, to submit. But something inside me snapped. Maybe it was survival instinct. Maybe it was pure blind panic. but I managed to force my legs to move. I shoved myself backward, crashing into the pile of boxes behind me. The creature jerked its head toward me, its mouth stretching into an impossibly wide grin, those needle teeth gleaming in the dim light. The whispering grew louder, almost a scream now, but I didn't care. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the door, my breath ragged and my heart pounding in my throat. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could hear was the pounding of my boots against the floor and the distorted, warping sound of the creature behind me, its elongated arms scraping against the metal walls as it followed. It wasn't running. It didn't have to. I could feel it gaining on me, the air growing colder with each step. The hallway seemed endless, the emergency lights flickering, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. The whispers followed me, relentless, filling every corner of my mind with fragmented thoughts that weren't mine. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get as far away from that thing as possible. Finally, I saw it. The exit. The heavy reinforced door leading back outside. My hands were shaking so badly I almost couldn't grip the handle, but somehow I managed to yank it open. The freezing wind hit me like a wall, the cold biting into my skin, but it was a relief. Anything was better than being trapped in there with that thing. I stumbled out into the snow, the door slamming shut behind me with a metallic clang. The sky was dark now, a thick layer of clouds hanging low over the horizon, blocking out any hint of the sun. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me, but I didn't care. I just kept running. The snow was deep, each step sinking into the powdery surface, slowing me down. My lungs burned from the cold, but I pushed on, the fear driving me forward. The wind howled around me, but it wasn't just the wind. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps crunching in the snow behind me. It was following. No matter how far I ran, no matter how fast, I could feel it getting closer. That unnatural presence, that crushing weight pressing down on me. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. There was no way I could survive out here on my own, not in this cold, not without shelter. But going back to the station was out of the question. I had to find somewhere else, somewhere safe. I stumbled over a ridge and collapsed into the snow, gasping for breath, my legs burning with exhaustion. For a moment, everything was quiet. The wind had died down, and the world around me felt eerily still. But that's when I heard it. A voice. It wasn't the whispering, not this time. This was different, clear, almost familiar. It was coming from the ridge behind me. Help me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It sounded like a woman, but something about the tone was wrong. Too flat, too calm, like it wasn't really a plea for help, but a statement. Almost curious. Against every instinct, I turned my head to look. Standing on the ridge was a figure. A woman, dressed in heavy winter gear, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and empty, staring straight at me. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching me. "Help me," she said again, her voice hollow, like it was being broadcast from somewhere far away. But I knew better. That wasn't a person. It was something pretending to be one. Suddenly, the thing stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, like it wasn't used to walking on two legs. Its mouth opened too wide, and the same low hum I'd heard before started to fill the air, vibrating through the snow, through my body, through my bones. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling backward, my mind screaming at me to run. But before I could take another step, the hum grew louder, deafening now, drowning out every other thought. And then, from behind the ridge, more figures appeared. Dozens of them, all moving toward me, their hollow eyes fixed on mine. I couldn't move. I was rooted in place, staring at the figures approaching me. They didn't walk, they glided, their movements too smooth, too synchronized, like they weren't bound by the same rules of reality I was. Their faces, all of them pale and expressionless, twisted into grotesque imitations of humanity, each one more distorted than the last. Some had no eyes, just empty sockets staring into nothing, while others had mouths stretched impossibly wide, showing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. The hum that filled the air was unbearable now, vibrating through the ground, through my bones, into my very thoughts. It felt like my skull was being split open, the noise pressing in from all sides. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it had closed up, my voice trapped somewhere deep inside me. The figures were getting closer, closing the distance between us. And then, the first one, the woman, or whatever was wearing her face, spoke again. "Help me," she said, but this time, the voice was distorted, garbled, like a broken recording stuck on repeat. It was mimicking, trying to sound human, but failing. I stumbled backward, my legs finally obeying as I turned and ran. I had no plan, no sense of direction. There was nowhere to go, but staying still meant certain death. Or worse. I crashed through the snow, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I could hear them behind me, the sound of their movements, quieter than they should have been, given how many there were. I knew they were following, but I refused to look back. I couldn't. The cold bit into me with every step, and the snow seemed to drag at my legs like it was trying to pull me under. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. What were they? Some kind of hallucination? But no, this wasn't in my head. They were real. Too real. The station. It was the only place I could go. I didn't want to go back, but it was either that or freeze out here, exposed to whatever those things were. I wasn't going to make it far in the open. The wind was picking up, and visibility was dropping fast. The station was somewhere behind me, back toward the ridge, but my mind was in such a frenzy, I could barely remember which direction I had come from. Then, through the snowstorm, I saw a shadow, another figure. My stomach clenched in fear, but this one was different, smaller, human. It wasn't gliding like the others. It was walking, stumbling, actually. I slowed down, squinting through the swirling snow. It was a man. His parka was torn, his face pale, and his eyes wide with fear. He looked like he'd been running for his life. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice hoarse and barely audible over the wind. "Over here!" He turned, his eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe he was someone from the station, someone who knew what the hell was going on. I ran toward him, and he stumbled toward me, looking just as panicked as I was. But then, as I got closer, something in his expression changed. His eyes. God, his eyes. They went blank, empty. His mouth opened, wide, too wide, stretching until his jaw cracked, and that same mechanical hum poured out, vibrating through the air. It wasn't a person. It was one of them. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw the others behind him, emerging from the snow, more of those empty-eyed figures. They were closing in, surrounding me. The sound was unbearable now, rattling my thoughts, making it impossible to think straight. I spun around, trying to figure out a way to escape, and that's when I saw it, the entrance to the station, barely visible through the storm. It was my only chance. I ran as fast as I could, my legs burning, my lungs on fire, the cold tearing at my skin. I could hear the things behind me, gliding silently over the snow, closing the distance. I didn't know how long I had before they caught up, but I wasn't going to let them take me. The door to the station loomed ahead, and I threw myself at it, fumbling with the handle, my frozen fingers barely working. I yanked the door open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. For a moment, I just stood there, my back pressed against the door, gasping for breath. My heart was racing, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, but I was alive. I wasn't safe, though, not by a long shot. I could still hear the hum, vibrating through the walls of the station, though it was fainter now. The figures were outside, waiting. They weren't pounding on the door or trying to force their way in. They didn't need to. They knew I was trapped. I felt it in my gut. They weren't in a hurry. They had time. I didn't. I had to think, had to find a way out of this. My radio crackled to life again, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I hesitated, then grabbed it, pressing it to my ear. "Do not leave the station," the voice said again, that same cold, emotionless tone. But this time, I recognized something in it. The voice wasn't human anymore. It hadn't been for a while. It had been corrupted. The hum, the signal. It had gotten to them, the people who had sent me here. It had gotten into everything. I dropped the radio, the static buzzing from it growing louder, more distorted. I was losing time. My thoughts were spiraling, everything around me warping, twisting, as the signal wormed its way into my mind. I needed to stop it. I needed to end whatever was causing this. I ran deeper into the station, following the hum. I didn't know what I was looking for. Some kind of transmitter, something broadcasting the signal, but I had a feeling it was here, buried somewhere beneath the ice, in the bowels of this cursed place. The deeper I went, the stronger the hum became, the more the walls seemed to close in on me. And then I found it. A room, deep in the bowels of the station. It was filled with strange equipment, wires running everywhere, old monitors displaying static, and at the center of it all was a machine. It was ancient, older than anything I'd ever seen, like it had been built decades ago, but was still somehow functioning. The hum was emanating from it, filling the air with its sickening, pulsating energy. I didn't know how to shut it down. I didn't even know if I could, but I had to try. I approached the machine, my hands trembling, and reached for the console. Suddenly, the hum shifted. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was a voice. "We are here." I froze. The air around me felt heavier, denser, as if reality itself was bending under the weight of the signal. I could feel it in my mind, clawing at my thoughts, twisting them, warping them. The figures outside the station, they weren't just there to kill me. They were trying to become me, to wear me, like they'd worn the others. I didn't have a choice. I grabbed the nearest tool, a wrench, I think, and swung it at the machine. Sparks flew as the metal collided with the ancient device, and the hum faltered, stuttering for the first time. I hit it again, harder and again, until the console cracked and the monitors went dark. The hum faded, replaced by an eerie silence that settled over the room like a shroud. I stood there, panting, staring at the broken machine. The voices were gone. The signal was gone. But as I turned to leave, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing in the doorway, watching me with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched too wide. It wasn't over. It was never going to be over. and now they were inside.